Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Ira Hayes and the flag raisers of Iwo Jima. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite-Sized Biographies. Follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's continue with our story about Iwo Jima. Despite the euphoria surrounding the capture of Mount Suribachi and planting the American flag on its peak, the battle was far from over. Most of the Japanese defenders were concentrated around the airstrip in the center of Iwo Jima, and the northern corner was also as heavily fortified as Suribachi. The 28th was given several days to regroup and recuperate before they were ordered back into combat. Their military objective was to attack the elongated strip that comprised the western portion of the island. This topography was comprised of steep hills and shoreline cliffs, with zero cover, defended by dug-in, well-armed Japanese infantry and artillery. It would not take long for Easy Company to be impacted by this formidable capability. On March 1st, Sergeant Mike Strank was leading his men through this open area when Japanese snipers opened up, wounding a member of the company. Strank and 3 other men found cover behind a ridge, but they were victimized by a frequent occurrence during the battle for the island. Naval artillery coordinated with infantry, one method of protecting GIs in open territory, but there were frequent friendly fire incidents, and Strank's group took an incoming artillery shell that practically landed on top of them, killing the company commander. Harlan Block became the new squad leader. He lasted only a few hours, killed by a sniper at dusk while communicating with his men who had dug in for the night, his exposed situation a frequently lethal consequence. Even high-ranking officers were not immune during this conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, the officer responsible for the Second Flag's installation on Suribachi, was attempting to organize his battalion to speed up the progress in the western sector. Assuming a frontline position, he was killed by mortar fire on March 2nd. A day later, March 3rd, film photographer Bill Janoust accompanied a group of soldiers flushing out resistance in a cave manned by Japanese soldiers. Presuming that all of the enemy had been killed, Janoust entered the mouth of the cave, illuminating the area with a flashlight, making him a likely target for Japanese gunfire from surviving defenders still alive in the deep recesses of the enclosure. Janoust was killed, and retreating GIs had to leave him as they quickly vacated the cave. They tossed satchel charges, heavy plastic explosives, into the mouth of the cave, a tactic that caved in the entire aperture, sealing off any inhabitants permanently. Unfortunately, it also sealed off Janoust, whose body was never recovered, despite attempts to retrieve him that continued into the 21st century. The 28th fell into a daily routine that was predictable but also terrifying. An artillery barrage directed at what was directly in front of the regiment meant slowly advancing by crawling on their bellies a few feet at a time over mostly exposed territory, a situation that was extremely costly. Then another afternoon bombardment and another advance at the end of the day. GIs finding any protective cover available in a shell crater or ditch, spending mostly sleepless nights, aware that individual Japanese soldiers might attempt to infiltrate their line at any time. On March 11th, John Doc Bradley, the Navy medic, took shrapnel from a mortar round throughout his legs. The wounds were serious enough to knock him out of action. Flown first to Guam and then to a military hospital in Hawaii. Although he didn't realize it at the time, for him combat was over, but he continued the war effort in an unprecedented manner. By March 17th, the Prime Minister of Japan acknowledged the defeat of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima. On or around the 17th, General Kurabayashi was dead. Exactly how this occurred is not known, but his premonition was correct, and his body was never found. On March 21st, another of the flag raisers was killed, Franklin Sousley, by a sniper when Sousley dropped his guard for a moment and wandered incautiously into an open area, perhaps not realizing that such threats still existed. Unfortunately for Sousley, 5 days later, Iwo Jima was declared officially secured. Over 22,000 Japanese were dead, their resistance so fanatical that 2 Japanese soldiers would not surrender until 1949. 26,000 Americans died. Hayes's unit, Easy Company, suffered an 84% casualty rate. Joe Rosenthal's second photo, known as the gung-ho photo, pictured a group of 18 men celebrating after the flag raising. Of those 18, 14 were killed or seriously wounded. Of Chandler Johnson's 2nd Battalion, a total of 1,688 men participated in the battle. Of those men, over 1,500 were killed or wounded. 25% of all World War II Marine deaths in the Pacific Campaign occurred on Iwo Jima. Many were buried in a military cemetery that was quickly constructed on the island, the war effort not permitting transport to the U.S. of such large numbers of casualties at that time. It would be years before many of these soldiers were repatriated and reburied in the States. Ira Hayes left Iwo Jima for Hawaii on March 27th. His unit would be reconstituted for what was eventually the attack on Okinawa. But Hayes's war was effectively over as well when he was identified as a flag raiser by Rene Gagnon in Washington on April 7th. The government already had decided to highlight the Iwo Jima flag raising during its upcoming 7th bond drive, the fundraising vehicle that helped finance the U.S. military during World War II. Gagnon at least attempted to avoid naming Hayes by stating that he did not want to reveal the involvement of one of the men. The Marine Lieutenant General conducting the investigation gave him a direct order to come clean. Gagnon identified the 6 men who raised the flag as himself, John Bradley, Ira Hayes, Michael Strank, Henry Hank Hansen, and Franklin Sousley, and these names were then released to the public. Although the specific reasons for Hayes' reluctance to be involved in the bond drive is unclear, he most certainly knew that Gagnon did not raise the flag and probably knew that Bradley didn't either. Although he would not want to prevent Gagnon from avoiding further combat, Hank Hansen was killed in action, so it wouldn't affect his service. When flown back to Washington later in April, Hayes even protested personally, identifying Harlan Block as one of the participants instead of Hansen. As Hayes was quite close to Block, he was angry that not only was Block killed in action, but the military didn't particularly care to accurately document his involvement. He was told that the Marines had already identified the 6 men publicly and ordered to keep quiet about the matter. For the duration of his participation in the bond drive, Hayes would not speak directly to Gagnon, only through John Bradley, who was flown in from his Hawaii hospital, still on crutches. Despite this internal friction, the 3 flag raisers began their tour at the highest level of the U.S. government, shaking hands with President Truman in the Oval Office. From there, it was on to the U.S. Senate and a standing ovation from this entire body. That evening, they were escorted to Griffith Stadium by House Speaker Sam Rayburn to see the season opener between the Washington Senators and the New York Yankees, introduced to the large crowd during pregame ceremonies. On May 9th, the actual bond tour would start in Washington, D.C., and was scheduled to make its way through 33 American cities. The Department of the Treasury's financial goal was to raise 14 billion 1945 American dollars in a country with an annual average salary of $1,700. Bonds originally purchased for $18.75 would mature in 10 years to $25. On May 8th, Germany surrendered, igniting even more patriotic fervor. On May 14th, the three GIs checked into the Waldorf Astoria in New York. An appearance at the New York Stock Exchange followed, as well as a massive outdoor rally on Wall Street. That also included the three surviving mothers of the other flag raisers. Then it was on to Boston, where 200,000 residents jammed a parade route and an additional 100,000 citizens participated in a rally on the Boston Common. These festivities also included private receptions and late-night bar crawls in which alcohol was readily available. Marine journalist Keyes Beach, who was instrumental in identifying first Rene Gagnon and subsequently the other flag raisers, was appointed as the chaperone of the three heroes during the U.S. tour. Ira Hayes had already developed a propensity for alcohol during his military downtime, beer rations more readily accessible in the Pacific than Coca-Cola. Unfortunately, Beach was also a heavy drinker, and Hayes quickly spiraled out of control. On his first swing through Chicago, he appeared at his hotel highly intoxicated only hours before an appearance, and Beach needed to sober him up enough to allow Hayes to stumble through a reenacted flag-raising ceremony at Soldier Field. On May 24th, after several stops throughout the Midwest, the tour returned to Chicago. Beach received an order from a Marine colonel to bring Hayes to a local military office. The Marine hierarchy was aware of Hayes's volatile behavior and concerned that he would embarrass both himself and the Corps. He was told that he was to be reassigned back to his unit. The face-saving explanation for all involved was that Hayes himself wanted to return to active duty. His request to see his family in Arizona en route was rejected, and he was handed a ticket to San Francisco and ultimately a reunion with Easy Company in Hawaii. The two other flag raisers would continue the Bond tour until it culminated on July 4th, ending where it began in the nation's capital. An estimated 350,000 people observing an elongated fireworks program, the effort a resounding success. With an initial goal of $13 billion, the total contribution by the American people was $26.3 billion. As he was still on active duty, Rene Gagnon was reassigned, eventually winding up in Qingdao, China. During a brief leave, he married his girlfriend, Pauline. John Bradley returned to Bethesda, Maryland, and the military hospital there for further treatment of his wounded legs. Back in Hawaii, Hayes, with the rest of his unit, trained and prepared for the inevitable invasion of Japan. But then on August 6th, the situation in the Pacific changed drastically. A single atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, destroyed the city and killed 70,000 people immediately. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks after this attack. On August 9th, a similar bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Despite the resolve of some members of the Japanese government and military to continue the war, Emperor Hirohito himself, in an unprecedented public address, declared on August 15th that Japan would surrender. A formal armistice was signed on the battleship Missouri on September 1st, 1945. The U.S. Army then began an occupation of the Japanese mainland. John Bradley had several surgeries on his legs to remove shrapnel. He was discharged in November 1945 and promptly returned to his hometown of Antigo, Wisconsin, marrying his girlfriend only weeks later. Ira was discharged in December as well and returned to the reservation along the Gila River. Living with his parents, he worked mostly as a day laborer, performing various agriculturally related odd jobs. He avoided any discussions of Iwo Jima and was dismissive of perfect strangers who would attempt to locate and interact with him as the Indian who raised the flag. Unlike today, there was very little discussion of the effects that warfare had on soldiers, the condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And anyone surviving combat on Iwo Jima, having witnessed the most horrible and terrifying aspects of military death and destruction, would have exhibited pronounced symptoms of this impairment. Substance abuse is a frequent result of PTSD. Individuals attempting to drink or drug away their feelings of depression, fear, flashbacks, and hopelessness. Ira Hayes became severely affected by alcoholism, spending his days working in the fields and nights drinking in bars in Phoenix and sleeping it off in the streets, arrests for vagrancy and public intoxication becoming routine. Possibly at a low point of depression and self-esteem, in May 1946, Hayes impulsively set out on a journey to the small South Texas town of Westlake, the former residence of his Marine buddy and comrade Harlan Block. Although he knew next to nothing about Block's family or where they even specifically lived, he felt obligated to right a wrong that had bothered him for a long time. In a pre-interstate America, he hitchhiked on 2-lane highways, threading his way south to Tucson, across New Mexico, and then southeast again to San Antonio, and a final jog deep into the Rio Grande Valley, almost to the Mexican border. Once he got to Westlake, he acted as if he was seeking work, wanting to remain anonymous, and asked for directions to the Block farm, aware that Wesley's father grew cotton. In 3 days, he hitchhiked 1,300 miles. He got a ride to the vicinity of the Block property, but then had to walk an additional few miles, the farm literally in the middle of nowhere. Told to look for a cinder block house in the middle of a field, Ira spotted such a structure, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. He scanned the horizon and noticed a man by himself, working on the crops. Ed Block, Harlan's father, recalled later that Hayes just walked up to him in the middle of the field and quietly introduced himself. Ira told him that he and Harlan Block had fought together, were good friends, and most likely to prove that he wasn't exaggerating, mentioned Harlan's outstanding high school football career and his work before the war driving oil trucks. Then he told Ed Block that it was Harlan who was not only in the flag-raising photo, but was probably the most prominent soldier in the forefront, actually placing the flag in the ground. He added that he had insisted to the Marines that it was Harlan, but they told him to keep quiet. It didn't really matter. Ira Hayes could not have known how profoundly the death of Harlan Block had affected his parents. Belle Block, Harlan's mother, was so upset, associating her current residence with nothing but grief, that she eventually convinced her husband in June of 1945 to move to California. They settled in Loma Linda, but Ed Block could not make a go of it. Unable to obtain a loan for a farm and with no way to make a living, he quickly decided to return to Westlake. Part of the trauma concerning the death of their son was Belle Block's unshakable belief that Harlan was in the photo. From the very first time she saw the picture, she maintained that it was definitely Harlan. To any doubters, even members of her family, she said the same thing over and over. "I know my boy." And now, standing in the middle of a cotton field, was living proof that Belle Block was right all along. Ed Block was so overcome that he could do little more than thank Ira for coming and shake his hand. The conversation only lasted a few minutes, and without even so much as a cup of coffee, Ira Hayes, typically shy around strangers, said goodbye and began the 1,300-mile trip back to Arizona. Not exactly on the best of terms with his wife at this point, it took Ed Block several days to get in touch with Belle. She immediately wrote to Ira Hayes, thanking him for his efforts and requesting that he put his opinion about Harlan's presence in writing. She then contacted the congressman representing the South Texas district incorporating Westlake. This congressman, Milton West, forwarded letters from both Ira Hayes and Belle Block to Alexander Vandegrift, the 4-star general serving as commandant of the Marines. An investigation was ordered, and after a Marine aide extensively interviewed Ira Hayes in Phoenix, and photographs not available immediately after the flag raising were consulted, it was clear that Hank Hansen, based on uniform discrepancies in photos of the first flag raising, which Hansen took part in, and the second, was not involved in the subsequent event. Ira Hayes' affidavit was reviewed by both Gagnon and John Bradley, and they agreed that Hansen was not involved and Harlan Block was most likely in the second photo. Reluctantly and quietly, in January of 1947, Vandegrift sent a letter to Ed and Belle Bloch officially acknowledging that it was Harlan Bloch in the photo, apologizing for the mistake, but blaming it on Joe Rosenthal, the photographer. John Bradley pursued a career in mortuary science, and he also resolved to refuse any interviews or even conversations about the flag raising. Rene Gagnon, like Ira, remained occupationally directionless. His initial attempts at a law enforcement career went nowhere without the requisite educational background, Gagnon a high school dropout. He returned to work in the textile mills of Manchester, New Hampshire, which also employed his wife, Rene believing that his status as a flag raiser would entitle him to something more professional and lucrative. However, he never made the effort to even get a high school diploma, which limited his opportunities long term. Still, 4 years after the war ended, Republic Films decided to capitalize on the patriotic fervor that still swept the country with a film starring John Wayne entitled The Sands of Iwo Jima. Although the film had little to do with Iwo Jima, Republic requested that the Marine Corps assist them in lining up Hayes, Gagnon, and Bradley for an appearance in the film. The Corps, always mindful of the power of Hollywood and the potential positive PR that would be generated, leaned heavily on especially Bradley, who was not enthusiastic, telling him if he refused, then the other two who had agreed would not be able to appear. The film was shot in Southern California and included a great deal of actual combat footage, but the three flag raisers were limited to 2 brief scenes at the end of the film, in which they are handed an American flag by John Wayne and a reenactment of the flag raising. Later, Bradley would tell a friend that their whole filming took less than 30 minutes, and the casting was nothing more than a stunt to generate publicity, a successful gambit that created a box office hit and Wayne's first Oscar nomination. Bradley went back to the funeral home business, Gagnon went back to the mills, but Ira Hayes realized that he was going nowhere in Arizona and decided to take advantage of a government program that would relocate Native Americans willing to receive job training in an urban setting. Hayes moved to Chicago in May of 1953 and took a job with International Harvester. He lasted there for 3 months until excessive absences and alcoholism resulted in his termination. Despite a succession of menial jobs, he hit the headlines in mid-October when he was arrested for public intoxication. A story in the Chicago Sun-Times generated sympathy, and the paper coordinated an effort to pay his fine and get him committed to what was known in the 50s as a sanitarium. Dried out with the assistance of the drug known as antabuse, he eventually attracted the attention of the ex-wife of Dean Martin, who hired him as a chauffeur and companion to her 4 children, Ira moving to Los Angeles to take the heavily publicized position. It didn't last. Arrested twice in a matter of a few weeks, he was told by a judge to either leave town or go to jail. He headed back to Arizona and the reservation. He enjoyed a period of sobriety, having become involved with Alcoholics Anonymous and employed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The 3 flag raisers would appear together for the last time on November 10, 1954, at the dedication of the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, an enormous bronze recreation of the 6 Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima. Both President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon were present, and once again the 3 Marines appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the country. Less than 3 months later, on the morning of January 24, 1955, 32-year-old Ira Hayes was found dead in the vicinity of a hut where he had spent the previous evening playing cards with friends and family and drinking heavily. Although the circumstances have remained murky, officially the death was ruled as a result of alcohol intoxication and exposure. While Hayes may have been injured in a fight with another card player, it is most likely that he passed out in sub-freezing temperatures and possibly aspirated his own vomit. In any case, Hayes was dead. While his problems had been a matter of the public record for some time, that such a high-profile individual, known and perceived nationally as a war hero, could die at such a young age in such a manner was a shocking development. His funeral mass, attended by 2,000 people, was held at a small reservation church. The following day, his open coffin, with Ira wearing his Marine uniform, the American flag draped over his lower body, lay in state at the Arizona State Capitol building in Phoenix, where thousands paid their respects. From there, he was conveyed to Arlington National Cemetery and burial, both his parents and Rene Gagnon in attendance, John Bradley declining to participate. For the rest of his life, Rene Gagnon made appearances nationally at various events, usually accompanied by his wife, who seemed to enjoy the limelight more than he did, his strange celebrity something he was never able to capitalize on professionally. He started and operated a travel agency, did accounting work, and at the time of his death was also the head of maintenance at an apartment complex when he died of a heart attack on October 12, 1979, age 54. Initially ruled to be ineligible for burial at Arlington, typically his wife waged a very public campaign to allow for a waiver, and 2 years later he was buried, only steps away from the Marine Memorial Monument his wife buried with him when she died in 2006. Following Rene's death, John Bradley, now the proprietor of his own funeral home in Antigo, would not even take calls from the press. Although well known in his community, he maintained his public silence about Iwo Jima and would not even attend reunions of his surviving Marine comrades. He lived quietly, raised a large family, and passed away on January 11, 1994, age 70. With Bradley's death, all of the flag raisers were gone, but this did not eliminate public fascination with the event. In 2000, James Bradley, the son of John Bradley, wrote a book about Iwo Jima, his father's involvement in the battle and flag raising, what became of many of the survivors, and his father's ambivalent attitude about the incident. The book spent 46 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was subsequently made into a 2006 Clint Eastwood-directed film with the same title, faithful to the story as recounted by Bradley's son. But then something remarkable happened, something that could only happen in the Internet age. In 2012, an amateur military historian with a fascination for the U.S. Marines named Eric Crelly started a website called fifthmarinedivision.com. He routinely received information, photographs, life stories, and tips from other like-minded individuals. In late 2013, Crelly was contacted by an individual from Wexford, Ireland, named Stephen Foley, who was especially interested in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Foley had questions about what Bradley was allegedly wearing in the famous photo. The alleged Bradley in the photo was wearing a light cap under his helmet, had trousers with cuffs that rested unfolded on his boots, and was not wearing the characteristic satchels that would have been attached to the belt of a Navy medic. Crelly and Foley had numerous photos taken on Mount Suribachi of Bradley before and after the flag raising. In these photos, Bradley is clearly wearing trousers with folded cuffs that reveal the leather leggings worn by GIs during World War II. He also did not have a cap on and was wearing his medical supply bags at all times. Crelly lived in the Omaha, Nebraska area, and he contacted a journalist at the Omaha World Journal, Matthew Hansen, who, initially skeptical, eventually became convinced that Crelly and Foley were correct. Unbeknownst to this group, ex-Marine technical advisors on the film Flags of Our Fathers had also become skeptical of the official identification, and one of these technical advisors helped submit Crelly and Foley's information directly to the Marine Corps. It took 2 years, but on June 23, 2016, the Marines released a statement concluding not only that John Bradley was not in the photo, but that the soldier previously identified as Bradley was Franklin Sousley. But Sousley had already been identified as being next to Hayes at the rear of the group. This soldier was then identified by photographic forensic experts as Marine Private Harold Schultz, a native of Detroit, Michigan, who, although wounded and the recipient of a Purple Heart, survived Iwo Jima. After the war, Schultz lived a solitary life, employed in Los Angeles as a mail clerk for the U.S. Postal Service, working there for 30 years, retiring in 1981. He befriended a woman in his apartment complex named Rita Reyes, and in his 60s, Rita and Harold got married. When the Marines publicly identified Schultz as one of the flag raisers in 2016, his only living relative, his stepdaughter, Desreen, said that she had always tried to get him to talk about his Marine service, but only once did he blurt out to her that he was in fact one of the soldiers who raised the flag on Iwo Jima. When she responded that that made him a hero, he quickly changed the subject and never discussed it again. When he died, Rita Reyes found among his possessions a copy of the famous gung-ho photograph autographed by Joe Rosenthal. On the reverse of the photo were the painstakingly printed names in order of the soldiers in the photograph. It is clear that for the last 50 years of his life, Harold Schultz knew that he was one of the famous flag raisers of Iwo Jima, but he never came forward publicly to claim credit. Within 3 years, the Marines announced another major correction. The mostly obscured figure, second in the group, always thought to be Rene Gagnon, was now officially identified as Harold Pye Keller. Because there were additional questions raised by Foley and others, it was decided once and for all to forensically identify unequivocally the identities of the 6 flag raisers. Because there was a photograph of Gagnon helping to fold the first flag while the second flag was just recently raised, and the second figure was clearly wearing a wedding ring, the investigation quickly determined that Rene Gagnon, unmarried, did not raise the second flag. Although in the Rosenthal photo, the second figure is obscured, in the Janoust footage, Keller, with unique uniform characteristics, is clearly identifiable. So, as it turned out, 2 of the 3 individuals that participated in the bond drive had never actually raised the second flag. Keller returned to his hometown of Brooklyn, Iowa, where he worked for many years for a creamery and the Maytag Corporation, and then served as the community's fire chief. He died on March 13, 1979, at age 57, also never publicly claiming credit for his presence when the second flag was raised. In a wartime scrapbook, he did save a letter from a Marine commander, referring to unfounded gossip as the spreading of untruths unbecoming of a Marine, a perhaps veiled threat to those who might be questioning the official identities of the flag raisers of Iwo Jima. While both Schultz and Keller may have kept quiet because of such intimidation, it is more than likely, after keeping quiet for decades, that they believed that they were nothing more than Marines doing their duty, underlining a statement that John Bradley made to his son years earlier. No, we aren't heroes. The real heroes are the guys who never came home. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Iwo Jima. Information for this podcast came from the books Flags of Our Fathers by James Bradley and Ira Hayes, The Akimel Udum Warrior, World War II, and The Price of Heroism by Tom Holm. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.